Good evening. Good evening. First, let me say how glad I am to have this conversation with you. You know, there is a sense in which when you are students at one of the best universities in the world, you can be cocky about it. But it also gladdens one to have an opportunity to have a conversation. As a young student, I read several books which were fiction books, and I want to imagine that many African students had occasion to read those books. If you remember, in the 1950s, that was the period when many African scholars were romanticizing about independence, and the books that were produced at that time talked about the pre-colonial period and the post-colonial period and the period immediately after the turn of events with military interventions in Africa. And the book that stands out in that category of books is the evergreen book by Nigeria's Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart stands out because it is written in the context of a society that is changing. And it sends us one story that if you don't adapt, then you fall by the wayside. Immediately after that book, Chinua wrote yet another book, No Longer at Ease. And No Longer at Ease has one of the chief characters, an African who leaves his country and travels to the United Kingdom to acquire education. And his education and other expenses are paid for by a traditional group called the Umofia Progressive Union. And of course, upon return, there are many expectations, but he does not fulfill those expectations. Another book that is written at that time is by Kenya's Mugobi, The River Between. And one of the outstanding statements that I have retained in my memory, having read The River Between several years ago, is the instruction to the chief character, Waiyaki. He is told to go and learn the ways of the white man and to bring the knowledge back home so that it may be utilized for the benefit of his country. There is a sense in which you are latter-day Waiyakis, whether you come from Nigeria or from Liberia or from Egypt or from indeed any country or from Darfur. There is a sense in which there are expectations of the community back home. And to the extent that I've been asked to open the debate about this evergreen subject of Afro-pessimism and Afro-optimism, it is important to understand Africa in the space in which she finds herself. Not so long ago, I had the privilege of speaking about a subject that is not so very different from the one that I am speaking about this evening. And I said that Africa stands out in all the continents as one which is still referred to in these terms. For those who are colonized by the British, it is referred to as Anglophone Africa. Even when in those countries no more than 5% speak the English language. Those who are colonized by the Portuguese will be referred to as Lusophone Africa. And those who are colonized by the French are referred to as the Francophone Africa. It is Ali Mazurui in the 1970s and 1980s that hazarded the introduction of yet another description, what he called Arabophone and Swahiliphone Africa. But it did not quite fly, because there are not many scholars who embraced and articulated those descriptions in a manner that allowed them to fly into the orbit of accepted scholarship. But that notwithstanding, the subject that we want to wrap our minds around this evening is the subject of Afro-pessimism and Afro-optimism. I've said that when one looks at Africa today, there is a sense in which Africa is still described in very romantic terms. Those who love her want to romanticize about Africa being the only continent in the world where the Tropic of Cancer traverses, where the Tropic of Capricorn traverses, and where the Equator traverses, and a continent whose climate is ever on an even keel. One may romanticize about Africa in that way. But there are those who take the view that Africa has failed to realize the promises that were made, or the promises that she made to herself on the eve of regaining her independence in the late 1950s and early 1960s, culminating in the death of apartheid regime in the 1990s and the birth of South Sudan in the year 2011. And there is merit in saying that Africa has suffered in that way. There is merit in saying that Africa has not punched at her weight or above her weight. There is merit when one wants to be negative about it, and when one wants to find, as some say, a solution, problem for every solution, to cite conflicts in Africa and therefore to dampen our spirit. In fact, if one were to start from that trajectory, one can remind oneself that only yesterday 180,000 people were expelled from Angola, from the Congo, to go into the Congo, which is xenophobic. One would say that you can see they don't even accept themselves. One can cite the ongoing conflicts in Central African Republic. One can cite the ongoing conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course one can talk about Somalia. But when one talks about Congo, I've always reminded my audience whenever I have the opportunity, when you see a country using the word democratic as a part of its name, know that it is not democratic. And that is very frequent in that part of the world. So there is a sense in which one can cite that. But one of the things that we don't remember is that the colonial project, as conceived by the colonizers in Berlin in 1884, was a project with a philosophy to it. And the philosophy of the colonial project was to subjugate the African continent for purposes of exploiting our resources. It must also be remembered, although this is something that can't be subjected to debate, and we will debate it at the opportune time, that the colonial project did not end because the colonizers suddenly had a revelation and they became suddenly magnanimous. But the circumstances that were created by the World War and the collapse of these countries after the World War were such as to justify the energization of the colonial project. And it's always instructive, particularly for students of law and students of political science, that in 1945, the year of the Charter of the United Nations in San Francisco, and in 1948, the year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there is a movement, a new entrants have entered into the arena in a very real way. In 1917, after the coming into being of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and therefore the communism is now becoming an alternative tool of analysis. And the coming into being as a world power of the United States of America does redefine the manner in which international relationship is being dealt with. And therefore the process of decolonization starts in that way. But it is always instructive that although African countries were colonized, the agitation to regain our independence, and I'm using these words very deliberately. There are those who say that we attained our independence. There are those who say that we acquired our independence. But I'm saying regained our independence as a term of art. And those of you who are students of political science and law will be familiar with the famous speech that was delivered in 1906 at Columbia University by South Africa's Pixley Kaisa Kaseme, entitled The Regeneration of Africa. And in that speech, Pixley Kaisa Kaseme says a number of critical things. He identifies that Africa was the cradle of human civilization. He's being romantic about it, but realistic at once. He is able to cite in his speech what had been done by different civilizations in different parts of Africa. Typically, of course, he'll talk about the pyramids of Egypt. Typically, he'll talk about the astronomy of the Dogon people. Typically, he'll talk about the Monomotapa Empire in Zimbabwe. Typically, he'll talk about the military exploits of Chaka the Zulu. Typically, he'll talk about the women warriors in Gabon and the Cameroon. Typically, he'll talk about the Ashanti Kingdom, and he'll cite all these as a clear manifestation of the existence of a civilization in Africa when the Caucasians were still living in caves. But it is instructive that that speech delivered in 1906 becomes the very speech which provides the raw material that Kwame Nkrumah uses in the speech that he delivers in Addis Ababa on the 24th day of May 1963, when on the occasion of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, he exhorts the 32 leaders who are present in Addis Ababa to remember a number of fundamental things. Number one, that the colonial project is a project that was not dead, and that it had given birth to another project which he described as the neo-colonial project. Number three, he reminds African states that what happened in Berlin was the creation of artificial states, and that what we claim to be our sovereignty is artificial. And that therefore it is incumbent upon the leaders of the day, Nkrumah says, that we begin the project of uniting Africa. And one may say that that is naivete at its most absurd, but it is not. Nkrumah is alive to the fact that Africa is diverse, that there are over 3,000 cultures and languages in Africa, but he is able to recognize that indeed in diversity there is unity, and that in diversity you can emphasize the things that unite you and de-emphasize the things that divide you. And much later on, when scholars examine the failure of African leaders to embrace what one may describe as the Nkrumahist approach, Ali Mazrui says that although we think that diversity is reminiscent of the Tower of Babel, he creates a term of art and says, indeed, it is the power of Babel. Of course, nobody listens to Nkrumah. Nkrumah says, let us live here with one army, let us live here with one currency, let us live here with one united command, let us live here having identified our capital. And he suggests either we have it in Bangui in Central African Republic or Leopoldville, now called Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. everybody agrees with him on the question of unity, but they are gradualists. They say, let us move slowly, but it warns them that when we get used to these sovereignties and the trappings of power, the erstwhile colonial master will come and undermine these. And as if he was a Jewish prophet, no sooner have African countries settled than the process of destabilization starts. And it starts a little earlier, because in 1960, before the meeting in Addis Ababa, we have a first coup d'etat in Togo when Sylvanus Olympio is overthrown. And a year later in Congo, Patrice Emery Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of Congo is also murdered. And subsequently in 1966, Kwame Nkrumah himself is overthrown. In 1967, we see that Nnamdi Azikiwe is overthrown. And then we see the beginning of coup d'etats in Africa. And that does undermine the development of Africa, whether it is in health, whether it's in education, whether it's in agriculture. So that Africa begins the weight of structured conflicts. These conflicts are many different parts of Africa. Still considers us as